Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your guest, Will Bachman, and it's a real pleasure to be here with my close friend, college roommate, Professor Zachary Schrag, who is the author of the Princeton Guide to Historical Research. Zach, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Zach, it's awesome to chat with you about your new book, and congratulations. I know it just is coming out today, actually. We're going to publish it, this episode, on the day of publication. Um, and this is, some people ask, okay, what are we talking about historical research on a podcast for consultants? But, there's so many parallels, right? We're both doing research. We're both taking notes. We're both asking questions, coming up with arguments. That this book, I think, is actually great reading for management consultant and anyone who's interested in history. Tell me a little bit about, first of all, what we mean by history.
So there are a lot of competing definitions of history, and I have taken the somewhat bold step of trying to craft my own, which is I argue that history is the study of people and the choices they made. So when I say people, I mean history is not just about some abstract past. If you are looking at geological strata, if you are just looking at artifacts and measuring them, you're not really, in my mind, doing history. History is when...
That's like geology.
Right. So you could have this idea that you'll see put out by, I think, Bill Gates and others of big history. History is everything. But if history is everything, then history is nothing because it doesn't distinguish it from other approaches to knowledge. What I would like to argue is that history is the study of people. And even when we take artifacts, say, or geology or those kinds of records and turn them into history, what we're doing is adding the human element. So, for example, there are histories of smallpox, which is not a human actor, but it's really the story of how people understood smallpox, how they reacted to it, how they quarantined themselves or vaccinated themselves or resisted vaccination. To me, that's the stuff of history. So, in today's newspaper, in a newspaper a few weeks back, because I know you're delaying the broadcast, in a recent newspaper, there's a story about discovery of new fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's one story we could tell about what those are made of and how big they are, and another story we could tell of the people who created them and preserved them. And to me, that latter story is the stuff of history. And then I also want to emphasize choices, because what we do every day is a series of choices, both how to act and what to think. And when we look at the great works of history, whether they're very traditional histories of presidents and generals, or whether they're social histories looking at mass movements of people, we are thinking about how people understood the world and how they chose to act in it. And again, to me, that's the really exciting part of history, is understanding what choices were open to people and which paths they took.
So I'll mention here that just the index alone, which I think is 10 or 11 pages, is by itself a kind of an argument about how to do history. It's what history is. And I mean, just the index alone is incredibly educational. So part two is about questions, and you talk about asking questions. One of the sections there is dialectics. Could you talk to me about some of the questions that historians ask, and particularly explain to me dialectics? I've always heard this term dialectical. I always think of Marx, but I'd like to understand what dialectics means and some of the other questions.
Sure. So a dialectic just literally means a conversation. I think that's the Greek root. But it usually means two ideas or forces in tension that you somehow resolve by doing some research and some thinking. And this notion of emphasizing dialectics, like much of this book, came to me in the course of nearly a quarter century now of classroom teaching, where I was confronted with the challenge of explaining to students what makes a good question for a paper. And frankly, some students will come up with questions that are of some interest, but not really appropriate for the assignment. So, for example, you could ask, how tall is the Washington Monument? And that does not make a very exciting question for history class because you can find it out, it's factual, and there's kind of a dead end there. A much more interesting question, from the professor's point of view anyway, is why is the Washington Monument 555 feet tall? What choices did people make to derive that particular height? So how do you get students from the merely factual questions of what to the more interpretive questions of why is a bit of a challenge for a teacher. And so I present a series of dialectics as examples that I think, if not force students, at least leads them to asking some of these why questions.
Okay, how about if we do a rapid fire here? So I'm just going to read the section of the index. You give me like a quick example. So opposing forces, give me an example.
Sure. So opposing forces is a classic where, again, you can think of military history. Thinking about the War of 1812, you've got American forces and British forces, and for any given battle, one prevailed and the other was defeated. So it's the historian's job to explain why. Why did one side win and the other lose? But we can also see this in politics. We could see this in social movements. We could see this in business. So Apple versus Microsoft, that would be the 1990s, a classic opposing forces case where you've got two companies in competition, also two ideas of how the computer industry would be structured. Now, in that case, both of them obviously survived and thrived, but Windows became the dominant operating system. How do we explain that?
Yeah. And I love this section because it's so applicable just to be thinking about a strategy document or a consulting document using these ideas. Makes it much more, comes alive, right? So internal contradictions, what's an example of that?
So an internal contradiction is where within a particular movement or force, you have people disagreeing about what they are trying to achieve. So, a classic one in the United States history would be the tension between freedom and slavery. And this is, of course, a very political issue right now with the debates over the 1619 Project, where how can American of the 18th century, the founding generation, both call for liberty and keep other people in bondage. But again, I think you would see some of this in the business world as well. I'm thinking, for example, about the debates over independent contracting status versus employee status, where you might have a company like Uber that is, in one stage right now in the United Kingdom saying we've got employees. In California, they're saying, no, they're independent contractors. There might be tensions within an organization about how they are presenting themselves internally and externally.
Sure. I mean, you can imagine, sort of that within a pharma company, they have this mission driven to, cure the world and improve health, but then they also have this profit motive. So they do need to maybe charge for their product and exclude some people from it. So there's that kind of dynamic.
Sure. And, just to call in on my own, any university has some of the same tensions as well, where we want to expand access, but also achieve excellence. We want to promote research, but also teaching. We want to keep tuition low for our students, but compensation high for our employees. So there are a lot of internal tensions to any organization, which also goes to another dialectic, competing priorities. I will say that these dialectics overlap a lot. They're in many cases, you have multiple doors to the same room. So, when students ask me, am I doing this dialectic or this dialectic? I often tell them, you're doing both. Don't worry about it as long as you're doing at least one.
Yeah. And then like hidden or contested meanings. Talk to me about that one a little bit.
So contested meanings is one that shows up in cultural history, in the history of technology, A great example is The History of Electricity. There's a wonderful book called Electrifying America by a historian named David Nye, and others have followed him as well, where if you look at the early history of electricity, electric light, for example, some of the earliest uses were for spectacle. So you'd have these world's fairs where these enormously bright arc lamps lighting up the sky, and people say, oh, this is wonderful. And some of the early adopters in the U.S. and England actually put arc lights in their homes. And they were dreadful because they're too bright and they make people look, really sort of wrinkled and ugly because it's just not a very flattering light. And so there's an example where, technology that is marvelous in one context turns out to be inappropriate in another. Things got a little better with the incandescent lights, but even those, the early adopters of those were putting bare bulbs in their houses, and that looked terrible too. So it's only when you get the lampshade that we redefine electric light as something that is appropriate for the home.
No kidding. Let's talk about sources a little bit. So talk about the range of sources that historians use and some of the kind of learnings that you've had along the last 25 years of working with sources.
Sure. So, historians have been using a wide range of sources really since the start of the profession, with some degree dated back to Thucydides, but in ancient Greece. But really, history as we know it today, I would say, gets going in the early 19th century when historians start looking into archives. So looking at the original documents that were produced rather than relying on secondary accounts that people had produced since. So if you were interested, say, in the Renaissance, rather than only looking at the books that people were writing in the Renaissance about what had happened, you'd actually go back to the original letters, diaries, reports of that period to the extent that they survived, and reconstruct what was happening on the grounds that it's often hidden to the people who are living through an event what is actually going on. And so again, I think this is pretty analogous to the business world, where companies' annual report will provide often a somewhat rosy, sanitized version of what happened to that company. And then it's only if you can get into the internal documents and the drafts and the arguments going back and forth that you would really understand the decisions within that. So historians, when they can, try to get to those primary sources, the sources that were created by participants or witnesses to an event, and maybe compare those to the more public-facing sources or the secondary sources, that is, scholarship written by people who did not themselves take part in the event.
You've written several books and worked in archives. What's it like to work with archives? I mean, physically. Is there someone's like looking over your shoulder, make sure you don't, kind of use a ballpoint pen? Is it, is it lots of handwriting that's super hard to read? Give me some examples of what it's actually like working with archives in real life.
Yeah, so archives are tremendously varied. Some of them can be very welcoming, some of them not so much. I've had, the good fortune to work in archives in the United States, where there's a pretty good ethic of openness and sharing. I've certainly talked to colleagues who've worked in other parts of the world where the archivists are very suspicious. There's a new book out about doing archival work in Saudi Arabia, and the author of that was describing very limited access, where she would ask to see a document. She would not be allowed to photograph it. She could take a few notes. If she went back and asked for it again, it would no longer be available, because the very fact that she had asked for it made the archivist think that maybe there was something that they didn't want shared. So different regimes have very different ideas about what government documents can be open, and this is true in the business world as well, where some companies, Ford Motor Company, for example, has made its older papers available to researchers, in Dearborn, whereas other companies may hold those documents secret more or less forever, or at least until bankruptcy. So first of all, it's really hit or miss what gets preserved and what gets revealed. In the best case, what happens is you go into an archive, they've got some documents that you want, and they come out a few boxes at a time. These boxes all look alike. They are gray, sturdy cardboard, acid-free, and you just don't know what's inside until you open up that lid. And sometimes it will be junk that's just not of interest. Some of it will be things that you've seen before, and some of it will just be mind-blowing new information. Certainly for 19th century, a lot of material has been handwritten. Some people in the 19th century had just gorgeous handwriting. You can read it as easily as print. And other people had really terrible handwriting that is going to drive you to tears. So it is an incredibly exciting and incredibly frustrating experience to go into the archives and just not know what you're going to see.
And beyond archives, you talk about periodicals, government documents, looking at fiction, big data, and then sources beyond traditional text. Talk to me about some of the types of sources that historians are using now that maybe they didn't as much in the past. Maps, images, portraits, movies, buildings, plans, places.
Yeah, so as I say in the book, historians are omnivores, and they will take whatever they can get. I myself work in a joint department of history and art history, and having been in that situation, I don't understand why all departments of history and art history are not joined, because the work of art historians is really quite similar to the work of historians, only they are using images primarily instead of texts. And historians are using texts as well as images. So we're both using images and texts, but a somewhat different emphasis. But certainly, you can find historians using textiles and trying to understand, both the production and consumption of textiles, for example, recreating old recipes, and riding horses over old battlefields. There are all kinds of ways that historians use whatever information is available to them as part of a larger puzzle. I do want to put in a plug here for periodical literature, because that, I think, is a very exciting resource for a lot of business history, again, a lot of history of technology. And when I'm sure that business consultants are very familiar with some of the specialized newsletters and, even, I guess, these days, Substack periodicals that are put out today. But you probably know that, while the New York Times might cover, a given industry once a month or once a week, there's some specialized newsletter that is really digging into the details about the latest innovation, regulatory change, market deal in vastly more detail than a big metropolitan newspaper like the New York Times ever could. Right? That is what they do, is look at that particular industry. And if those documents are preserved, then some decades or centuries later, a historian can try to replicate what was going on in that industry. So, one of my first research projects as a graduate student was looking at the decline of streetcars in New York City. And there was a journal, the Electric Railway Journal, that was coming out and covering in great detail what was going on in that industry in the 1910s and the 1920s in a way that no other available source had recorded.
You've always been, I think, way ahead of me in terms of your embrace of like technology and using software and sophisticated tools to do your work. And you have a chapter here in Tools of the Trade. Talk to me about some of the ways you organize information as you gather it, and some of the recommendations you have for history students.
So I think historians and probably other professions as well are an interesting and rather extended period of indeterminacy between the older methods of paper based on index cards and notebooks and what I think may eventually come out as a more standardized set of tools for taking notes and organizing information. But right now, a lot of historians are improvising. So, one thing I suggest in the book is that word processors are not very good for taking notes. If you've got lots of material that you want to sort and rearrange, that's really not what a word processor can do. Obviously, if you're dealing with lots of numbers, spreadsheets are very good for dealing with numbers, and I can thank Will Bachman for teaching me how to use a pivot table on Microsoft Excel. But spreadsheets are pretty poor for organizing text. I've certainly seen people try, but if you've ever pasted a lot of text into an Excel spreadsheet, you'll know that it kind of crosses the boundaries, and then you have to wrap it, and then it messes up the rows of everything else. A spreadsheet is really not designed for that either. So I myself use a relational database called FileMaker Pro for all kinds of projects, both my research and my administrative work at the university, and also some personal things like organizing my books. And, if I could snap my fingers, I would make relational databases as much a part of the standard Office suite as word processing and slide decks and spreadsheets are today. I think that was a really sad turn that took place sometime in the 1990s, where it did not become part of the standard software skill set that people have or the software that was presented in their workplaces. You may remember Apple had this product called HyperCard. There was all kinds of hype about it. Never really took off, and I think that was an unfortunate path not taken, because I think historians in a lot of professions could benefit from having powerful databases where you could sort material and arrange it and do queries and save those queries and customize the output in more powerful ways.
Okay, this is interesting. So I'm one of the ignoramuses that does not use a relational database. I'm a big fan of Evernote, but I think that's a simpler thing. Talk to me a little bit about how you put notes into FileMaker Pro when you're doing historical research and you come across either something in an archive or something in a journal article or a newspaper or government document. So what does that look like when you type up a note in a relational database?
So what makes a relational database relational is that you can have multiple tables that are connected by unique identifiers. So, for example, in your email client, whatever that is, you have someone's address, right? And you can have many conversations with that address and then ask the client, show me all of the emails I've had back and forth with Will. And what the client is doing is it's searching, okay, I'm gonna find all of the Bachman emails and put them together. Or you could search that by subject, header, or by date. There are lots of different fields in that email, and the clients are set up to sort by that. So a relational-based database is somewhat similar. For me, the basic unit to start with is a bibliographical entry. It could be a book, it could be a journal article, it could be an archival collection. And then within that, I want to take multiple notes where I'll say on page 7 of the book it says this, on page 15 it says that, on page 132 it says such and such.
So the source, you just have one place where you put all the source information for that book.
One place for the source information, but then it spawns individual notes. So that note on page 17 is a separate note.
Yeah.
In a separate table called notes. If I realize that I have misspelled the name of the author, and I change that in the bibliography, it will automatically change it in all of the notes that I've taken because they're linked only by one field, not by that author's name.
Right. So they're linked to that. They're linked to that like source entry. So,
yeah. So it's a one-to-many relationship from source to note.
So if I have The Great Society Subway by Zachary Schrag, that would be my bibliographic entry. And then any note that I find that I want to write up would just be a separate object in there just tied to that. And you might put in the page number, but it would just say, Great Society Subway, page 17, right?
Right. And let's say on page 17, there's a note about planner Harlan Bartholomew. So that would be in the note. And let's say I'm taking notes on another book, The Broken Heart of America by Walter Johnson, that also has information about Harlan Bartholomew. That would go to a note. And then if I've taken notes on lots of books and lots of newspapers, and then I want to say, what do I know about Harlan Bartholomew? It's going to give me a list of all my notes about Harlan Bartholomew, regardless of the book that they came from. So rather than having all my notes from the Great Society Subway, I'm just going to have the notes from Harlan Bartholomew from that mixed in with the notes from Walter Johnson and what other sources I've had. So it's a way to rearrange the information that you've gotten.
And then do you then go and tag things like this is appropriate for probably the chapter 5 that I'm currently writing or chapter 7, so that you can, Harlan Bartholomew, notes, you wouldn't, if you had a lot of notes about a topic, that you could group them or organize them as you go along, so that you could be working on a specific piece of writing or a specific, part of the effort.
Yeah, so this is, a classic debate, I think, at this point in information design is how much tagging you want to do. So tagging is often extra work, and it depends on your particular project whether you want to put in that extra work. So, for example, with my most recent monograph on the Philadelphia riots of 1844, I had a lot of different newspapers. There were something like 18 different daily newspapers in Philadelphia in the 1840s, and there were weeklies and monthlies. So lots of different competing newspapers, all reporting on the same events. And for each of those, I would naturally put in the date of any article that I recorded. Now, I could have put in a separate tag saying, here are the dates of the events, but that would have been a lot of work. We're talking about hundreds of different articles. So for that, it was usually easier for me just to say, okay, I'm interested in the first week of May 1844. Give me all the articles published in that week from whatever newspaper. So I'm getting some of the benefit of tagging without the actual work of putting that in. That said, another project that I did for about 10 years was to run a blog about the regulation of human subject research in the social sciences. Again, a somewhat obscure topic, but there are those who care deeply about it. And I did about one blog entry a week for about 10 years. So, we're talking about hundreds of blog entries. And using the Blogger software, which, again, is a kind of database, I did tag those entries and would go back and retag ones when I came up with a new tag that I thought was useful. And for that, it did turn out to be pretty helpful. I, or really anyone who read the blog, could click on sociology and find only those entries on the blog that talked about the regulation of the work of sociologists. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all tool set for any given project. And, the best advice I can give are some general ideas about how you want to scope out your work. The one thing I would say about something like FileMaker over Evernote is it's very customizable. So you can very easily write scripts saying, so for example, I'm working through a newspaper that comes out once a week. And so I'm done with one issue. I can create a little button that says, now I want to create an entry for that newspaper 7 days after the one I just read. And, it's specific to, say, the Catholic Herald from Philadelphia in the 1840s. And again, you could do this for a newsletter that's being published today. And that saves me a lot of time to have that customizability.
Broadly, across your book, what are some of the recommendations that you have for history students that might be a little bit of surprising to me or our listeners, who have taken some history classes at some point and written some term papers? What are some of your recommendations that that maybe kind of go against the grain a little bit, or that that not necessarily every historian would agree with?
For one thing, I do think my definition of history may be a bit controversial. I think that compared to some, I'm generally a bit of a lumper rather than a splitter. So one of the debates in my profession is about the degree to which computers have changed the work of historians. And, there have been really for more than 20 years, lots of discussions about the revolutionary possibilities of digital technologies, whereas I tend to see them as more incremental. Certainly, there are great opportunities both with mass digitization projects like Google Books and also individual digitization projects where it's one historian with a digital camera taking thousands of pictures in an archive and then reading them slowly at home, which is of great help to historians with small children or others who cannot spend extended periods away from their home. So, I tend to see the digital changes as important, but not revolutionary. And I would extend that as well to the topics that historians cover. So there have been many waves of the so-called new history, basically one after another, taking history beyond, again, the studies of kings and generals and presidents, trying to bring more people in, whether that's women, whether that's workers, whether that is people of color. There have been, lots of different definitions of what it means to write bottom-up history. But I would argue, and again, some would argue against me, that these kinds of history can still learn a great deal from the older forms. So, one of the most beloved works of history to come out in recent decades is A Midwife's Tale by Martha Ballard. By Dr. Ulrich, about Martha Ballard, this midwife who lived on the Maine frontier around 1800 and kept this very sparse diary, just a few lines per day, and this diary was known, but it took the genius of Laurel Thatcher Ulrich to turn this into a story. And I look at that diary and I think, well, this isn't too different from Theodore Roosevelt reading a commander's log from around the same time. Naval history, again, very traditional white men, but he's dealing with some pretty sparse entries and trying to see patterns in them, much as the way that Laurel Thatcher Ulrich would do a century later. So I don't see a sharp divide between top-down and bottom-up history. I think in both cases, you're looking for protagonists, you're looking for challenges that they faced, you're trying to, again, find patterns and ideally create a plot and a story that readers can follow.
When we're reading history, talk to me a little bit about part 4 of your book, Stories, and how we should be thinking about the choices the historian made. You talk about storytelling, characters, plots, events, speculation. You talk about style. So talk to me about, just as a consumer of history reading it, what should we be looking for as we try to understand a book of history?
So I do think it's important for everyone, consumers and producers, to understand the power of storytelling. And in the business world, the great innovation here was the Harvard Business School case study, where I don't quite know when those began, but the idea was that one of the best ways to learn business skills was by reading stories and talking about those stories, right? So that is an example of the power that narrative has. And you'll see this also in an initial public offering or some kind of pitch to a venture capitalist firm. You want to tell a story about your business that will appeal to people. And what does a story need? Well, it needs a protagonist and usually conflict. You want to get your character up a tree, one of my colleagues told me. So I think it's important when you sit down to consume a work of history to understand that the historian has made some very deliberate choices about who that protagonist will be and what kinds of conflicts they face. So, again, the current debate over the 1619 project is a big one, where the argument of that project was to argue for the importance of African Americans in American history. And so, when you sit down with a work of American history, you might think, well, where are the African Americans? Are they included? Are they excluded? Or if they're present, are they being the actors or are they acted upon? There have been, many debates about the Reconstruction period in the United States after the Civil War, for example. And, it's very hard to write a history of the Civil War and Reconstruction without mentioning African Americans. But generations of historians wrote it as, here's what white people thought about African Americans, or here are the decisions that white people made for African Americans. Whereas more recent generations are trying to say, okay, here are some of the decisions that African Americans made for themselves. So it is, I think, very helpful to be alert to those decisions. It's not to say that historians are trying to trick you. Some are, but most aren't. It's just to say that they always have to make decisions about emphasis, and they often have some decisions to make about sympathy as well. Are they presenting these characters as heroes, as villains, as something in between?
What some people might have a view of history as this somewhat musty, staid kind of almost sort of fossilized thing that's going on. But I know in conversations with you over the years, it's helped make me realize that it's this constant arena of change and discussion and debate and constantly changing views. Give me a couple examples of current debates today in the world, in your area of expertise in American history, of the types of debates that are going on, the types of things that are past beliefs that are being revised.
So this is a little dangerous ground because I think historians as a profession say two things about their work. One is that it is political, in that what we do is an effort to understand the world and therefore perhaps to make it better. And then when we get blamed for being too political, we say, no, we're just scholars reporting the facts. And there is some real tension here. But, a perfectly good example, and this applies to my Philadelphia book, Fires of Philadelphia, are histories of immigration. So as you may have noticed, the country has been debating immigration quite intensively for many years, arguably since the founding, but certainly since Trump took the stage in 2016. And that has, historians have responded to that and thought about that. And they've been exploring, for example, the ideas of what it means to restrict immigration or to welcome immigrants. We have competing narratives, both within the profession and outside the profession, about whether America was designed as a country of immigrants or a country to exclude immigrants. So there are stories of how Irish immigrants were treated in the 19th century. Mine is one of those, but there are others as well, where they were not prevented from arriving on the basis of race, but they were, in some cases, deported as being paupers, as being too poor and likely to become a public charge. Then the immigration restrictions that begin on the federal level in the 1880s are targeted originally against Chinese people, and then you have expanded restrictions based on people's nationality. So, that's a very fertile area of study, and it is very much wrapped up in present events. Historians, live in societies, and the questions they ask and the answers they get are invariably affected by the world around them.
Fantastic. So, Zach, we will include a link to your book here in the show notes. And if people want to learn more about your work, where would you point them to go?
So I have a website, historyprofessor.org, that actually preceded the book. I've been working on that website and its predecessors really since my earliest days of college teaching. And so in many ways, the book is an outgrowth of that work. It's much longer, but you can certainly get a sample of my advice as well as some more recent postings at historyprofessor.org. And if you like that, there's much more of that in the book.
Fantastic. Well, Professor, thank you so much for joining today.
Always a pleasure, Will. Hope to see you soon.